Thank you very much for the invitation, for AWI and Ian to bring us down here. My name's Phil Tickle. I'm one of the founders of a fairly new small company called Cibo Labs. We're based out of Toowoomba and Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast. There's 2 3/4 of us. But we're basically working across Australia at the moment. So we've got clients in I think most states at the moment. So I suppose we established Cibo Labs about 18 months ago after about 10 years of frustration in our ability to really rigorously produce estimates of pasture biomass at a farm level. So I've got a remote sensing and agricultural background, so I came off a mixed mixed grazing and cropping background in southern New South Wales where I grew up. And then got into this sort of technology, the remote sensing technology, about 30 years ago. So I've been working in a range of areas, and forestry as well as agriculture over the last 30 years. And particularly in the last 10 years, been focusing on things to do with land condition and pasture biomass. I was part of a CRC for spatial information for about 8 or 10 years doing this sort of work. And so Cibo Labs was really born to after a decade to really actually change the way we were doing it. So using some very different approaches, which I'm going to go through here today. Who here has used or aware of pastures from space? Okay, a couple of you here. Pastures from space, it was established in the early 2000s and recently, late last year, the business folded up. But it was really, it was some IP that CSIRO developed and was commercialised through a government business enterprise, and unfortunately it wound up late last year. But I want to start this by saying, actually, while we're trying to achieve the same sort of things, we're doing it very, very differently in terms of the way we're approaching the problem. So as a business, we're focusing absolutely through the lens of what you need on a day-to-day basis. So we're trying to ask or answer questions like, how many kilograms of available pasture have you got in a paddock? And relate that to your mob data. How many grazing days have I got before I reach a particular biomass threshold? If I haven't got any rain, if I'm looking at ground cover levels, what's my current ground cover, and potentially how many grazing days might I have before I reach a particular ground cover level or a pasture level. We can also start to ask questions around how's the land condition of my property changing as well. So as well as looking at today and in the last week, we can go back 30 years and look at basically a 30-year history of every individual paddock on your property. So who's got a drone? Okay, who's crashed the drone? There's been a lot of hype over the last few years around drones, and you see if there's ever going to be an ag tech forum, there'll be a picture of a drone. There'll be a picture of a drone flying over a paddock with a guy with a lab coat and a tablet or something. In these pastoral areas, there's actually, I suppose, we're coming at it from while there's some very specific applications that drones are very, very good at, in these sort of large, extensive areas, people that are suggesting that drones are viable are probably a little bit ahead of their time. There's real issues with battery life and a whole range of other things in terms of being able to get a drone to get across your property. But once you've got all that data, the ability to process that data is actually really limiting as well. So I suppose we're approaching it largely from satellite data, but we actually are processing drone data for clients as well. We basically want to use the right technology for the right application. So in terms of the satellites, while there's been a lot of advances in the drone space, there's been way more advances in the satellite space that you never hear about on the TV. So we've now got the ability to image the entire globe once a day at 4-metre resolution. So basically good enough to pick up a couple of tables on the ground or pick up see a car in a paddock. We can do that every single day with the same spectral resolution that an average drone would have. And we can also, that'll soon be available twice a day over the entire globe. Now you don't need that information twice a day, clearly, or potentially every day. But the capability is there to start to do that. We've also got a number of international space agency initiatives that are coming to coming to maturity. So a lot of you will be aware of NASA, and NASA are basically collecting data, and we've had Landsat data, and we've had other data sets that say Pastures from Space used for a long time. The European Space Agency 3 years ago launched a constellation of satellites which is imaging the entire globe every 5 days with 13 different bands of information, so going right from the visible through to the mid-infrared, so things that we can't see with our eye, and they're giving it away for free. This domain used to be basically only government agencies had the resources and the skills to utilise, get access to and utilise this information. Now you can be a company of 1 or 2 people, and if you've got the, if you know how to use it, you can basically access and process this data. So we can look at the whole country on a sort of a 5 daily basis at 10 metre resolution. We can do things around fractional ground cover. I'm going to talk about that. We can do things around pasture biomass. We can look at things like around weekly changes in biomass and cover quite readily on any paddock in the country. So this is just an example. Here's the daily imagery. This is Planet Labs imagery. And you can see here, this sort of resolution is available over the entire globe on a daily basis now. So in the case of Queensland and Queensland in particular, they're using this information to monitor land clearing. So as part of their land clearing legislation, so they're basically building a database of every single tree in Queensland, and have the ability now to detect basically whether a tree canopy has disappeared or not. The technology is certainly changing, and in the case of Queensland, when they detect some change, they're starting to send out basically like a traffic warning sort of letter to a landholder, which basically says it's just like the policeman said, I thought I saw you speeding. They're sending out letters to say to people, we think we've detected some change on your property. What is that change? So things are getting pretty. The technology is out there, and yes, in a lot of cases, actually being used as Big Brother. What we're trying to do as a company is to turn this whole dynamic around. Every single producer should have exactly the same information that government agencies have got and a lot more, and you know way more about your property than the government agencies ever will. So we as a company are basically trying to turn that dynamic around and give you access to better data than the government's got, and that's the sort of data that the government's got. We can also start to in terms of the frequency and getting access to this stuff. I was sitting there on the Saturday morning after the main flood event. This is the Queensland floods through here, just to give you an example of some of the capabilities here. On the Saturday, the main flood event that came through Julia Creek and Cloncurry. No government agencies actually produced any images of the floods. I downloaded some data here, and that afternoon, a couple of hours after the satellite went over on the Saturday, I actually had maps out to the various emergency services and a whole bunch of corporate properties, and they were basically out there looking for cattle basically with helicopters using the maps that have come out of here. So this information is available. To give you an idea, that's 100,000 square kilometres of flooded area, and then we've actually identified every single property, so we've got a property database. There were about 600 properties over an area of about 100,000 square kilometres. The United Kingdom is 200,000 square kilometres, and what do we say South Australia was? 1.5? 950. Yeah, okay. So more than a tenth of the area of South Australia basically underwater during this flood. So it was just immense. And it went from basically from Uwandin here, Julia Creek. That's about sort of over 600 kilometres, is basically the way that the crow flies. So it basically think of driving 600 kilometres basically with water on either side of you, as far as you could see on either side of you, or wouldn't. It'd be 80 kilometres either side of you would be the continuous water for 600 kilometres in a car. So just the scale is immense. So we've been providing imagery into the cattle companies and others basically with their response, and also with the emergency services. Local government agencies couldn't get access to this sort of stuff, so we've just been posting data onto a blog and processing the imagery and giving it to the local governments and others in the area as well. So you can see there, that's just a little time slot there. That's over a sort of over a 3-week period there. The floods coming down through to Lake Eyre there. They're travelling at 20 or 30 kilometres a day. So I did an update yesterday or the day before. Actually, no, yesterday. And the floods were about 100 kilometres south of Birdsville going through. So I suppose what I'm trying to get through there is just in terms of the scale and the ability to start to image these sort of the whole country. whether it's a 2 hectare paddock on a coastal area somewhere, or in this case here, the Barkly Tableland, we've basically got the ability to be imaging those sort of scale of paddocks pretty much on a weekly to fortnightly basis now. So what are we doing differently? So there's been for about 30 years, there's been a general method of using Ndvi imagery. So you would have heard that term Ndvi. I would say, as a statement, all of the precision agriculture companies that are imaging crops are using Ndvi imagery. Now Ndvi basically was developed as a method for monitoring the greenness or the vigour of vegetation. So while a plant is green, it's actually telling you something. So hence, basically, it's entirely valid to be using it in cropping systems. It's really simple, it's fairly robust, and in a cropping system, when you know the trajectory of the crop, going from bare through to the end of the growing season, it makes complete sense and it works. As soon as that crop tips over and starts to senesce and starts to go from green to some other colour, Ndvi's are now no longer any use to you. So you think about a pasture system in terms of the complexity of pasture systems and the seasonal dynamics of pasture systems. We need something very, very different. And so pastures from space, best available science at the time was using these greenness indices and worked very, very well in Mediterranean climates, in improved pasture systems where you've actually got a known growth path or a known phenology and you're only chasing the green component, works fine. But I suppose we're looking at systems that can do far more than that. And in a pasture system, there's a fair part of the year that actually where the pasture isn't green, and it's usually way more sort of dynamic than a crop system. So what we're doing is using what they call a fractional cover method. So basically what that allows us to do is to, for every single pixel, so a 10 by 10 metre pixel, we can predict the proportion of bare ground. So it all adds up to 100%, the proportion of green vegetation and the proportion of brown vegetation. We can also, through a time series analysis, we can basically we can assess whether that pixel has a tree on it or not, because the grasses pulse through the seasons, and obviously the tree canopy has a more stable growth, seasonal growth cycle. So we've got algorithms that basically allow us to look at the bare and the brown and the green constantly, and to also then look at basically how the trees pulse and how the pasture pulses, and basically remove the tree effect. So not a big issue here, but if you've got woodland vegetation or that you're grazing, or paddock trees that are impacting on your grazing system, we can basically detect the trees and remove them from the estimates of biomass as well. We've got some new methods for collecting data on the ground, which I'm going to go through. We're basically predicting estimates of kilograms per hectare, and irrespective of whether it's brown or green, we can predict the amount of biomass that's there. It doesn't have to be green, it can be any colour. And really the key of what we're doing is turning this complexity into some basic information, effectively at a paddock level, for you to either use as a simple traffic light map or integrate into your farm management apps like AgriWeb or MyGrazing or whatever. So this is an example here. On the left there's AgriWeb, this one's AgriWeb, we've got Hitachi in there. The principle's the same. What we don't want to be building front ends and sort of have to, for you to have to use another app with us. What we're actually trying to do is work with the other farm management software providers where we can. So if you've got farm management software that's basically got maps like this of your property, recording mob data, mob movements, all those sorts of things, we should be able to basically, if we get permission from them and they give us a little key for you, basically give us the keys to your, so we're not actually getting your data. What we're actually doing is somewhere, in the case of AgriWeb for example, your data is stored in a secure database, like they all are, and it's available to the web, on the web through to you. So you'll access this software through a cloud system and it'll be on your phone. What they do is basically give us an encrypted code that basically allows us to effectively post the data to a location, and then their database then actually grabs that and pulls our data into the system. So we're not going and getting your data, we're basically posting our data to their system, and then their system then finds it and then brings it into the system for you. So in the case of AgriWeb there, we've got kilograms per hectare basically dropping straight into their paddock data. So one of the challenges is actually what's the truth in terms of pasture biomass. So who here is actually walking into a paddock and basically saying, I think I've got this many kilos? Is this sort of a regular thing that you're doing in terms of biomass, or I think this paddock here is actually higher or lower than that paddock? What we're trying to do is, I suppose, to get to a point where we can actually, it's much easier to collect data on biomass in the ground. So, and I've spent a lot of time in the paddock over the years, and others here as well. The whole process of cutting pastures and weighing them is a really laborious, boring task. It's exactly the same as checking waters, really. It's same sort of thing. So what we're trying to do here is to develop some new ways of doing it. The New Zealanders are smart. They've been using these pasture meters for decades. We're starting to use these pasture meters here in Australia. But it's actually all about understanding the variability in a paddock. So when you walk into a paddock, can you truly say that paddock is all 500 kilos or 1,000 kilos? It's not. You'll have some parts of it are bare, some parts of it are twice the biomass, some parts of it are half the biomass. And if you walk into that paddock and walk to the wrong location, so you might have gone through the gate and there's just a water there, and you don't go to the right part of the paddock, you could be hundreds of % out in terms of what your sense of the biomass is. So the first thing we want to do is basically when you do go into the paddock, because you know those paddocks better than we do, but in terms of when you go into the paddock, we want to identify the lows and the mediums and the highs of potential biomass. And if you're then doing some assessment, we basically want you to go to the right location, collect some data, whether it's visual assessment or cuts, however you're doing it, and then we can basically build a predictive model based on that data that you've collected. And also, when I'll show you in a minute, data that other people have collected as well. So these are some of the tools that we're using. Just as an example, I've got my plate meter here for later on, but you can now walk across the paddock with a plate meter. It's this thing here, and it's basically giving you an estimate of the height and the density of the pasture as you're walking across the paddock. You can't use these things in really rank. If you've got lots of phalaris with sort of hard stalks poking up, it's not going to work terribly well. But if your pasture, even if it's dry, if it's got some bulk to it, it actually works. And we're using this stuff in Mitchell grass, buffel grass systems, lots of native pasture systems, as well as loose and other systems as well. So, but what it allows you to do, you can walk across the paddock and it's connected to your phone, and you can see here every second pace as I walked across this paddock, every second pace I'm dropping the meter, and you can see here 1900, 1800, 1800. 1300, 800, 1200. There's a lot of variability. Basically, just every time you take a step, there's variability there that you need to capture. So what we're trying to do is find basically much more sort of efficient ways of capturing that variability in the paddock before we start building these models around it. So this just gives you an idea of some rapid on the fly calibration. So that's a buffel grass paddock that myself and Cole Payton were in last week. It's all dry, wasn't rank, it worked quite well, and that's the relationship there in terms of height and biomass. So we've got a very high effectively quite for this system, quite a high relationship with me walking across basically that paddock there. And to give you an idea, so Cole, he's been in the game for 40 years. He basically would normally walk around that paddock, stand like that, and then estimate how much biomass is there, and he'd do that 20 or 30 times across an area of half a hectare. And he might do it 20 or 30 times. I basically ripped across there, and I've got a couple of hundred estimates. While he's got 20, I've got about 200 estimates of biomass. But he's critical because he knows the pasture species and the composition and pasture quality and a bunch of other things. So what we're trying to do is work together here, where we can basically bring his knowledge together with some more rapid ways of collecting data in the paddock. So what that translates to, so it really doesn't matter whether it's a 2 hectare paddock on the coast, or in this case here this is the Barkly Tablelands. That's 500,000 square kilometres, so that's basically more than half the area of South Australia, where we imaged last year. So that's the Barkly Tablelands there, it's the Downs country through here and spinifex and desert through here. Each one of those properties, the average size is over 1 million hectares. And we worked with about 8 or 10 corporate companies last year. So you think, how do you, in the space of a couple of months, get estimates of biomass for every single paddock and every single property over 500,000 square kilometres when we aren't going to collect a single bit of data while we're doing it? We're actually getting other people to collect the data for us. So getting other people to do things for you is always quite challenging. So what we're trying to do again here is to get things far more efficient in the paddock. So one property, for example, just in here, 1.5 million hectares, they took about 3 to 4 weeks with a person basically driving to each paddock and doing an assessment of biomass in each paddock. And they had one single estimate of biomass per paddock, where the person sits on the back, gets on the back of a ute, looks across the paddock, and makes an estimate of biomass, and they use that to set their stocking rates basically for that property. What we've basically done here is to give them a little simple app. Now this is a free app where people can collect data. It's got a little, it's just used on your phone. Collect a GPS location, take a picture. In this case here, we've got what land type are you in? Are you in Downs country or turpentine or spinifex country? What land class are you in? A, B, C, D, and then the next screen is basically how many kilograms of biomass have you got. It all then gets up, and we actually get them to do some pasture cuts to calibrate themselves as well. So they do it by eye, but we're also getting them to do some cuts to calibrate. And then that goes, say they can hit the button there when they get back to the homestead, and that all gets loaded basically into a Google spreadsheet. And the locations of the sites. And the way we set this up is that basically everyone could actually see the data that everyone else had collected. So this particular case, this is actually Paraway doing some data collection here. But what we did with 6 or 8 companies across 6 or 8 properties, we're actually able to, for each of them to spend a couple of days in the paddock, not a month in the paddock, a couple of days each in the paddock, and then collected enough data to then calibrate ourselves across the entire Barkly tableland to produce kilos per hectare across the Barkly on a 15-day basis. So this is the stuff that Cole, the guy was in the picture a minute ago. This is the data he's collected, and as soon as you get home, it basically uploads. You've got the data you collected, you've got the photos, the whole lot. It's all safe, it's all backed up. You won't lose it. So what that translates into, here's a single property here. This property here is probably 1.5 million hectares. Those little circles there are 3-kilometre grazing radiuses around each of the water points. And then we've got kilos per hectare. Then we've got an average kilos per paddock. And then we can go in and then look at basically the available biomass inside and outside the watered areas here. And give them basically a total kilograms basically that they've got access to and how much they haven't got access to if they haven't got their water available. So what that translates into is a simple traffic light map. So basically in this scheme here, this is total kilograms, or this is actually tonnes here. The blue paddock there has got lots of biomass but no water. These paddocks here have got lots of water and no biomass. So this is a really simple way of basically for a station manager to just see what's going on. So this is being delivered every 15 days. And then down the bottom here, they get a spreadsheet for that individual paddock there. That's a 40,000 hectare paddock, one paddock. And there's basically 3/4 of it isn't watered. So you can see here the numbers, the feed on offer. Every 15 days or so, you're actually getting a new estimate of average kilograms in the paddock and the total feed on offer. So that's one end of the scale, but we're doing exactly the same thing at the other end of the scale. So this is a property that's about 3,000 hectares. Now, in addition to getting these kilograms per hectare and what's available, now even in a 100 hectare paddock with a bunch of lazy steers or some dorpers that don't want to leave with lambs that don't want to leave the corner, you've got utilisation issues. Doesn't matter what size of the paddock is, there's actually utilisation issues. And whether it's soft country or harder country in a paddock, or lazy cattle, or animals that haven't been sort of really inducted, if you like, and they go into the paddock and they go and sit in the water and they never bother going on the other side of the hill. So in addition to this sort of product here, what we're also then looking at is change products over each month. So this case here, I'll get to some examples with Trevor's place in a minute. This is actually the change in the last 30 days. So we're providing that estimate of kilograms per hectare and the estimate of total kilos in the paddock. And then we're also providing here is a percentage change from the previous 30 days. So those areas that are, this is actually a property near Canberra, those areas that are red are basically only 40 to 80, red or orange, are only 40 to 80% of the biomass that was there 30 days ago. There's a centre pivot obviously, and the areas that are green are basically either the same level of biomass, so 100 to 110%, or there's a couple of, or that's the centre pivot, so this area here, the centre pivot has up to 200% of the biomass it had 30 days ago. Well, no surprises. But a lot of these paddocks here have less than half the biomass that they had there 30 days ago. So you would hope that that lines up with these pasture rotations, and this is an opportunity here just as a visual for a producer basically to look at what they did 30 days ago and what the outcome's been in terms of pasture cover and biomass. So we're looking at cover levels and biomass at the same time. So here's just another example just to see how things rapidly can change. So this is a property up near Tamworth, about 5,000 hectares, and they had in January they had about 60 mil of rainfall through Christmas. This is summer rainfall country. They had quite a lot of pasture growth, and they had upwards of sort of a couple of thousand kilos, 2,500 kilos of biomass in their native pasture systems up in here. And then they had 10 days or 2 weeks of 45-degree weather, and that couple of thousand kilos of growth just got completely nuked, and it went from green to brown. And then so there's the a month later, the biomass relative to the previous month there. So it's those red areas there are basically again they're half the biomass that they had there the previous month. But critically, this area here, which says basically it's got 75 to 100% of the same biomass, so this area here, that was still 2,000 kilos of biomass. It was about this high, but it was all dry. So as that pasture biomass changes, in that particular case there we had some rapid growth. We actually still had a couple of thousand kilos there, but it had gone from green biomass to dry biomass. So it was still there, but it was brown. And we can tell that through some other images. So in terms of pasture quality, in this area here, that's a cowpea crop. It's obviously going forward. So what that allows us to do then is to start to look at a paddock level what your feed on offer is at a per paddock. So this is just one property here. This is property here. That's for a bunch of that's for just a handful of paddocks. What the sort of the weekly feed on offer is, and some are going up and some are going down. And then that one there is basically the total feed on offer across the property. So from, when was that? So from August, and that's through to November there. He's actually obviously on a fairly declining plane of pasture availability over that few months period. And it actually got way worse after that. Simple little map interface as well. So we've got when you load your data into the system, you get a simple little map interface there as well, so you can hover over it and you can look at the kilos per hectare, the total biomass, and then the change on a monthly basis as well. So that same property there, this is just a bit of a dynamic here. If you're looking at, you can see in here as this little thing flashes through, you can see it's all actually covered by imagery, and then occasionally you'll get you'll get some clouds in there. So this is ticking through every 5 days. And if I just try it again. So, okay, no data, some clouds in there. One of the other things that we're doing here as well is that the sky isn't always clear. So every single 5 days we image the property, we process it, we detect the clouds, we detect the cloud shadows. So we've basically got a measure of pixel quality, if you like, and then we basically only provide you with the clean pixels. So if you've got a paddock that's a property that's 75% clear and 25% cloud covered, we still give you the data. If I go back, you can see that number in there. So for that particular paddock that I'm pointing at, for that 5-day period, we've made an estimate of biomass, and we've basically got 92% of the paddock has valid data in it. So for one of those passes, there was probably a little bit of cloud in there, but you might find there's paddocks in there that basically where there's been a cloud sitting over the paddock. Previously, the systems that basically were doing this sort of stuff, they would wait for a clean image, which might take 2 or 3 weeks or a month. We take every single pixel that's imaged and process it, and then deliver you every clean pixel we can actually give you, basically, once we've detected the clouds. So Trevor's basically been kind enough to basically just allow us to have a look at his property. So I only got this data on Thursday or Friday last week, and we just loaded it into the system. And so this is just basically a few quick snapshots. So the data was, the property was loaded in on Thursday or Friday, and the imagery that was collected here, we had some imagery the day before, and then this imagery that you're looking at here was collected on the 24th of this month. So that was earlier this week, and there'll be another acquisition tomorrow. So we process it basically pretty much the same day that it gets collected and delivered to you. So that's basically a natural colour image. You've got the Google Maps in the background here, and that's like a natural colour image of the property. Here's the fractional cover image I was talking about here as well. So the areas that we haven't got a paddock layer available to us here yet, but so you can see the individual paddocks that are in the imagery, and you can see a lot of variability inside the paddocks as well. So this is 10 metre data. How many hectares are these paddocks, Trevor? Sorry? How many hectares are these paddocks here?
That one would be that whitish one, about 98.
Okay, so 100 hectares. So you're seeing a lot of variability in the paddocks. Now we've put a buffer around Trevor's property here, so the boundary is basically here. You'll see that in a minute. If I just skip forward. So there's the the blocks that we've got in the system for Trevor's place, and so we just put a buffer around. Whenever we load a property in, we put a small buffer around the property. So for any of those paddocks there, we've basically got an estimate for every 10 metre pixel. We've got a proportion of bare ground, dry stubble or dry vegetation or photosynthetic vegetation. And this paddock here, there's still some stock in here. I think you were saying, Trevor.
On the white piece,
Yeah, so there's still stock in there. That's basically dry stubble. Yep. So that paddock there, we're seeing here we've got quite a lot of bare ground. We can see there's a rim of area there that's probably still got some high levels of stubble on it. This paddock here, it's stubble grazing, and it's still saying there's actually there's a fair bit of cover on top of that. And if we go to the next one, that's an Ndvi image. That's just looking at the relative greenness. So this is basically what Pastures from Space would have been imaging to you. And at this time of the year, when it's not green, it's basically useless. So that paddock up there, we're wondering what's going on there. If we just go back, you can see the difference in the apparent soil colour or whatever's going on there with the crop history. It's just a different colour. We're seeing here that there's still blue in it, so there's actually a fair bit of dry stubble or whatever's. Was it vetch, as you were saying? Failed lupin crop. So you've still got a bit of cover there. But it's certainly not growing. Ndvi basically says there's something there there's not. And then when we actually then go and predict the biomass that's there, we've still got in this stubble paddock. And if we go back to Ndvi, it says there's nothing. And then we look at it using our method here, and it's basically saying those areas there are higher biomass than these areas here. There's nothing green growing there at the moment, from what I can gather. And then there's a change image there, so that's looking at the last 30 days. So the areas that are orange are basically sitting at about the same biomass levels that they were sitting 30 days ago. That paddock there, so that has some stock in it prior to the last 30 days. That's looking at this one just here. Yep. So that one there basically says that we're still carrying about 75 to 100% of the biomass that we were carrying a month ago, and then that paddock there saying that basically we've got in the order of 50% of the biomass that was there 30 days ago. Now that's a relative measure. There's pretty much nothing there, but we're saying there's 50% of nothing, pretty much. Yeah. So we're getting down to some very, very low biomass levels. Similarly at the other end of the spectrum, using Ndvi methods, normally, in these sorts of systems, you mightn't be operating past a couple of thousand kilos, but Ndvi methods basically saturate at about 2,500 kilograms of biomass. So if you've got a loosened crop, by the time that loosened crop is closed its canopy, it's well and truly over 2,000 kilos, and Ndvi will tell you nothing basically from then on. Whereas the system we're using, takes it up to basically 5,000, 6,000 kilos before you haven't got any more information that you can provide. So just some examples here. This is Bruce Wood's place here, some small paddocks. Just quickly zip through. You can see here, just the micro relief there as well, just these sort of the gradual topography, which I think there's about a sort of a metre or so of topography going through these paddocks. And you can see the differences in sort of in cover and utilisation inside those paddocks in just that micro relief. That's the Ndvi. It's basically saying no, there's nothing there. It's showing you in the green in the pivots, but in the dry country it's showing you nothing. And then with our biomass estimates, we're basically picking up that micro relief inside the paddock. And then what we turn it into then, so we go from, we also see here, see the little gaps in the tree in the paddocks there as well. So we're actually detecting the trees, and actually the trees get removed from the image as well. If you've got some paddocks that have got a lot of tree cover, we extract the trees and give you an estimate of the biomass just on the ground, not the trees. And then once we've done that, we can then basically give you an average kilograms per hectare. So that's just a simple map, a traffic light map, basically giving you, that's kilos per hectare across the property. And talking to Bruce, basically that was where his mob movements had been recently. And then there's a total feed on office, that's kilograms multiplied by the area of the paddock. And then there's the feed on offer changes basically over the last, what's that there? So the last month or so. I think there basically the feed on offer changes across the whole property. So what people are using this for, apart from looking at, so we'll skip down through here. No, it hasn't got it there. That property I was showing you earlier on, that 5,000 hectare property, it's part of a property group. There's 6 property groups of about 50,000 hectares. They've got 5 property managers, and what they're wanting to do is every month, and they've got animals moving basically across their 45,000 hectare 5 group sort of enterprise. What they're wanting to do there is basically every single month they come together, they've got the estimate of biomass per paddock, an estimate of biomass for the whole property, and then they can put all 5 property groups together over the 45,000 hectares every month and say this is basically effectively my total pasture budget for the enterprise. It's $170 million sort of investment, and then they can basically move animals around that entire enterprise depending on what their feed on offer is and what their likely feed demand is based on their mob structure. So that's basically where we are now, and I just wanted to just quickly walk through some of the future. Our ability to estimate biomass is we really have nailed that over the last 18 months. If one of the first questions people ask is basically how accurate is it? Well, in terms of the field data, if you can get on the ground and estimate biomass, say in a ryegrass subclover pasture, if you can estimate the biomass on the ground to within plus or minus 250 kilos per hectare, you're actually doing pretty well. When we take that field data and then relate it to the satellite data, we're getting the similar levels of accuracy basically. So whatever level of accuracy you think you can estimate on the ground, we're getting similar levels of accuracy with our predictions from the satellite data. But it's got to be calibrated. We've actually got to have, some data in the paddock to help us calibrate that, but we don't need a lot. So really some of the next things that we're looking at, pasture quality is obviously the next one. So I talked about our ability to do green fraction and brown fraction. So there's opportunities here now to see as that pasture is haying off, to start to moderate our estimates of kilos per hectare based on some simple factors around senescence. So what percentage of the pasture sward is brown, and then use that to, depending on your pasture types, and Ian, I don't know, lots of more than that, than I would. But there's opportunities here to basically moderate that estimate of biomass based on basically some feed quality and digestibility measures. There's also some things that we're looking at in terms of leaf nutrition. This is work, they've been doing this in the cropping area for a while in terms of nitrogen management. It's just a bit more complex in pasture systems, but we're just starting some work around looking at leaf chlorophyll and changes in seasonal leaf chlorophyll as that's a measure of leaf nitrogen, and obviously then there's relationships between leaf nitrogen and protein and so forth. So there's opportunities here to make some great and very rapid progress in this space here. And there's some little tools here that we're using here to collect leaf estimates of leaf chlorophyll in the paddock as well. So just to scale that up, this was a first attempt last year. So this is the Barclay again, so 500,000 square kilometres. We don't know the pasture types in every single paddock, but what this is allowing us to do is to basically get an estimate of using the chlorophyll. We can basically separate the woody areas from the non-woody areas. In this case here, we're able to separate the Mitchell grass downs from the Spinifex country. So that's basically sort of giving you a bit of a story and a snapshot of what's happening at the paddock level. And what I wanted to do now is just to give you a bit of a glimpse at some of the other things that are going on at a sort of a national scale that have a potential to impact the industry. And I suppose I'm sort of doing a lot of work in Northern Australia, and the pastoralists in Northern Australia are getting a fair old hammering from the NGOs around tree clearing and land stewardship, and basically social licence to operate. And you're seeing now with other organisations, the whole agricultural sector, there's basically that whole land stewardship and social licence to operate is getting more and more important across all industries, all sectors, all commodities. So as part of the beef sustainability framework, we're doing some work with MLA, and we're at the moment processing 30 years of time series data, so all the stuff that you just saw a minute ago. We're processing that over the last 30 years for every single property in the country. So there's about over 100,000 properties, rural properties. We're going through a sieving process to identify through NLIS and PICS data basically where the animals are. Now this is all pretty sensitive information, as you can imagine, in terms of people's, there's a perception of privacy here. All of the data that I'm showing you here is publicly available data. So just last week, WWF and the Wilderness Society published in the Sydney Morning Herald images of a property that had just undertaken some, I think, legal land clearing. They had a permit, but they were taking images of it. They were processing satellite imagery, the same satellite imagery, by the way, and putting stories in the paper about a producer that's actually undertaking a legal land clearing. McDonald, they weren't, but that doesn't have to destroy the story. McDonald's have got a global policy now of not buying any beef from any producer that's basically clearing any woody vegetation. So you translate that to other sort of social licence sort of issues around ground cover, biodiversity management, etc., etc. You can see this is actually sort of coming. I suppose it's just at the fore at the moment with the pastoral industry in the north. So what we're doing is basically processing every single land parcel and every single property in the country, and we're building a time series graph. And this is just this is actually over a region, but we'll have basically and this is locked up. It's going to be safe. Don't worry, we're not going to be releasing this stuff for every property. But what we're doing is basically processing at a property level, and then aggregating that data up basically through NRM regions, through ABARES regions, various other biodiversity regionalisations. And what that allows us to do is to look at things like ground cover and things like tree cover, and ask questions like how many producers nationally are improving ground cover levels. And so we can then look at, and you know yourself through the NRM groups, there's big pushes around ground cover and managing your cover. We can start to tell a good story, but rather than just saying effectively what people, all the bad things around tree clearing and land degradation, this is going to be an opportunity for the industry to start telling a good story about effectively what is happening out there in terms of adoption. So in the case of Queensland with the tree clearing, this sort of area here, there might be 400,000 hectares of trees cleared in Queensland. How many producers actually are doing broad-scale clearing? Well, 99% of them aren't doing any broad-scale clearing. They're clearing fences. They're clearing just those minor things around infrastructure. There are only a few producers that are doing large-scale clearing, and those that are doing that are probably doing it with a permit. So we're trying to refocus the sort of the story here. Now, it's not up to us to tell that story. All we're doing here is basically processing the data. It's going to be basically sitting inside MLA, and then the plan there is basically to have an opportunity for the producers to have something there to tell their story when they need to defend themselves, as well as to be able to do these sorts of things on a regional basis. In this case here, there's graphs of the actual area of trees is actually going up rather than down. You can see here that line there, that's actually the tree clearing through the 90s. So there was some tree clearing in this area here, and it's basically stabilised, and then there's been a little bit here in recent years. So I suppose what I'm trying to get through here is that you can choose to interpret this as Big Brother, and as I suppose when a lot of people see this sort of information, it is. It's for some, if you're a producer in Queensland and you look at this sort of stuff, it can get a bit scary. But we're, I suppose, as a company, we're doing this through the lens of being an advocate rather than a regulator. And so this is information here. These are individual property boundaries, and so this same data is available for everywhere in South Australia. Your property now, if I want to, I can go and find your property, and if an NGO wants to come along and basically give you a hard time for something, they can come along, they can get this sort of imagery, they can find your property and they can put this in the paper. So this is actually an estimate of ground cover. So this is basically the end of autumn last year. This is actually in the one of the reef catchments. There's lots of issues around ground cover management in the reef catchments around for erosion. This is that bare ground index I was showing you there. So the red areas are dominated by bare ground. The blues basically areas that are holding cover, and the green are areas that are growing things at the moment. You can see here some patterns evolving that have got straight lines in them. If we look at this property just here, in the middle here, this map here is a map of ground cover deciles. So every month you look at your rainfall and you can basically say this month is above or below average rainfall. Or the Bureau will say that this month we had 25% of the average rainfall for this month. What this is doing is actually looking at ground cover levels over the last 30 years for autumn. So what these areas here, so I just look at any of the red areas, that's basically saying that those red areas are in the lowest 20% of ground cover that area has seen in any autumn in the last 30 years. So it's basically a bit of a it's a traffic light map there. So now you drive along the road and you can see basically sort of land management out the window. But I suppose this is trying to tell a story here that across the landscape there are places where ground cover levels are always low. And as an industry, basically, what's your objective as an industry? So there's probably no one in the room here that wants to basically to be degrading their property. They want to be improving it. So this is actually an opportunity here for the industry to sort of see the whole landscape, and it can get very, very sensitive, I know, but I suppose what we're seeing here is that the NGOs are already using this against the industry. So this is basically an attempt to get people on the front foot. So our intention here is to not to go out and basically share this information with every producer in the country, but basically to give, when a producer basically wants to access this information, they'll have the information there to tell their story basically. And there's just a zoom in of that property. So things are quite changing, and I suppose it can get a little bit scary, but I suppose we've now got Google knows everything about us. We let Facebook access our information, and we choose to do that. Sometimes we choose without really knowing what they're doing with it. But I suppose the message here is this information is out there, and let's be forewarned and forearmed. So I suppose when you take that extend that a little bit further, what we want to try and do here is start to build an environment where every producer in the country can become basically a bit of a weather gauge for the industry, if you like. So we've got, I suppose right now some of you might have weather stations in your paddock and you share that with BOM, and that becomes part of the sort of the national record. If we're trying to produce estimates of biomass, we can either go to you one by one and basically ask, do you want to sign up to our subscription? And you say, yes, I'm interested. We'll say, okay, I need you to spend an afternoon in the paddock or a day in the paddock. And then we go and ask you, and we ask you. And if we do that independently, we're just wasting a whole bunch of time. So what we're wanting to do, sort of in terms of the way we're approaching this, with a similar approach to the Barclay, we're going to be processing, to give you an idea, we've just made a business decision a few months ago. We're going to be processing the entire northern Australia, so from basically all of Queensland and NT and the top half of WA, so all of the pastoral systems in Australia, northern pastoral systems, we're going to be processing that every 5 days over the whole of northern Australia. As a company, we're just doing that at 10 metre resolution every 5 days. So we've now got the capability to say, okay, right, should we basically then start doing the same sort of thing for southeast South Australia or southern South Australia? And then, how do we go about producing these biomass maps? So if we take that sort of approach, if we basically got each one of you here that was interested in understanding your biomass or ground cover across your property, if every one of you spent 2 hours in the paddock and just basically stood there for a couple of minutes and at each point and you'll spend more time driving than you will collecting data, I can assure you, opening and closing gates. Stand there, take a picture, tell us what the pasture biomass is, what you think it is. You might do some cuts, hopefully, take a picture of it and just say it's phalaris or it's ryegrass or whatever it is. And before you know it, we've actually got data across the whole of the southeast. And a couple of weeks after that, we've actually got an estimate of biomass across the whole of the southern sort of pasture system for every single paddock in the pastoral system. Now, we don't know what the pasture type is in every paddock. Only you know that. But we can have a very good stab at basically estimating sort of the fortnightly changes in biomass, and then if you know what the pasture type is, you can then obviously convert that to what your nutrition is at a paddock level. So we can do that. We've got a simple free app. It works on a sort of Android or an iPhone. Spend an afternoon in the paddock, and once that data comes back to us. We compile it, and so in the case of the Barclay, every week we compiled the data that was coming into us, and basically then every couple of weeks we update the model, and every time a bit of new data comes in, that data then gets used and sort of compiled, and then builds a better model, a more accurate model, and then we go back and reprocess the historic stuff so it's consistent. So if we had a situation where we just took your data and then built a model, and then the next person comes along and we change the model, we can't go back in time consistently. So what we do is then get your data and the next guy and the next guy, and then continually improve the model, and then back process the data through time. So there's some real opportunities here for those that are interested in sort of moving into this space. One of the biggest challenges we've got is data collection, and one of the major inhibitors to doing this, and Pasture from Space is a good example. There was some field trials done 15 years ago, a few more done 5 or 10 years ago. There might have some more trials. A bit of data gets compiled, a model gets built, and basically that model then stays static. It never learns anything new. The approach we're taking here, every single time a new bit of data comes in the door, the model learns, and I suppose what we're doing here is basically what Google do with traffic. So when you go into Adelaide, they know where every single phone is, and you ask for basically put an address into your system and want to navigate through Adelaide. They tell you how long it's going to take by knowing where everyone else's phones are, and that everyone else's phone contributes to basically them working out how long it's going to take you to get across Adelaide. We're doing pretty much exactly the same thing. We actually want to basically take little pieces of data. You can decide whether you want to share that data globally or not. So that spreadsheet I was showing you, you can decide whether you want to put that up and make it available to everyone, or you could just say, I want it to contribute to the data pool, but no one else is going to see it other than me. So that's a choice that you can make, but it just then allows us to compile that data, build the model, improve the model, and then you decide whether who else you want to see that individual site data. But importantly, when it comes to the estimates of biomass, it only becomes relevant when it gets tied into your management data. So we need a paddock map. So who here has a digital paddock map? Got your paddocks maps with Google Earth or something? So one of the limiting factors here, with this previous work here, we've got the boundary of every single property in Australia. So we can go on to produce an estimate, basically a map like this, that'll have biomass in it. We'd prefer that only you or only the owner of that property sees the biomass on that property. That would be our preference. If you haven't got a paddock map, you can't go back and do things like these sorts of things here, looking at individual paddocks, but you certainly can get an idea of the variability across your property. And most of the time, it's about half a day's work to get a paddock map using Google Earth or something like that. So I suppose that's a proposition to you in terms of a group. I suppose we're a commercial business. We've got to make a dollar. But we're seeing here lots of opportunities here to really improve the efficiency of anything we collect on the ground, and we're certainly wanting to be. We don't want to be providing this information to everyone, but we only want to be providing it to the people that are using it. But there's lots of opportunities here to improve the way we actually go about building this data through time. And just as a little snapshot, just to finish off, I suppose where we want this to get to, and this is a bit of a sort of a proposition at the moment. There's lots of dashboards being built, and we've put a bit of a proposition to MLA that when if you go into something like My MLA, who's here uses My MLA at the moment? So a few of you. There's about 40,000 users, I think, at the moment, and about 25,000 sort of fairly active users. You go in there and you get your weather data and your market data and other things. There's an opportunity to have a private space where this information is basically being delivered to you. So all those sensitivities that I was talking about how do we actually give people access to this information in a fairly private way. I suppose what we're wanting to do is to have industry platforms made available so they already know who you are. You've been authenticated, it's a private environment, so it's only your data in this sort of environment here. MLA haven't signed up to this, by the way. It's just a proposition in terms of the way we're seeing sort of opportunities. But there could be an industry space here where this information is basically made available to you in a private sort of environment for you to look at over time. All right, I might leave it there. Thank you very much.